Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. This session is the first of two parts called Use It or Lose It. And normally we're talking about things like budget dollars, things that you have to spend before the end of the year and end of the quarter. But I got to tell you, Use It or Lose It is just important for time off. Dave Russell, you did some of that, didn't you? How important is Use It or Lose It, my friend?
Yeah, I found out it's really important. Went on vacation for the first time in about 2 years. Hit 7 different theme parks in Orlando area, which was epic good fun, but definitely recharged, ready to be back.
Fantastic. And we're glad to have you because, frankly, I ran out of bad jokes while you were gone. But Dave, one of the things that we had planned for this month was the idea of looking at, we've got about 9 weeks left in the fiscal year for most organizations. And so often this is a time when people need to be thinking about things they need to make sure are in the 2022 budget. But often we see that there's a little bit of stuff left to do now. And if you just had a few last dollars that some other department didn't spend, could you put those to work? And so this is the first of two parts. Let's take a look at slide 1 and look at, when organizations earlier were asked, what does modern data protection look like? This was the list. And actually, while this is the list of what's modern, let's do something different. While folks are chiming in on where you're from and what time of day it is, et cetera, we have a question we want you to pile on in the chat. And that is, what production clouds are you running? Office 365? Are you running VMs in the cloud? Are you running databases in the cloud? Think about what kinds of production clouds we're running. But let's bring that slide back up because this kind of sets the stage for why that stuff is important. Dave, you spend a lot of time with enterprises talking about what's coming next. Kind of break this down for us, if you would.
Yeah, I really like that when we stack rank this by the most important there in the light green, that automation and orchestration rises to the top. And we'll double click on that a little bit more. But, when we think about what modern is and we think aspirationally what more organizations should be doing, a more complete, or for some cases, a disaster recovery scenario and automation, which should go hand in hand. I love that rose to the top.
I do too. The other thing that kind of strikes me is, of all the things that are on this slide, look how many times cloud shows up, right? I mean, we got DRaaS, we got moving from one cloud to another, moving from on-prem to cloud, standardized protection for IaaS and SaaS. I mean, there's just a lot of cloudy stuff on this slide. And so when we think about use it or lose it and things that you ought to be doing between now and the end of the year, I think one of the first pieces of advice I would tell folks is get your data out of the building, right? And I guess there's really two ways to do that, right? Cloud tiering and cloud connect. You want to break those down?
Yeah, so one of the things I think is very interesting about Veeam is inherent in the product is something we call Cloud Connect, which allows you to link to the service provider of your choice. We have over 27,000 of them geolocated around the globe. So regardless of what vertical or country you may reside in or size of business, we've got a partner that's right for you. And so it could be as simple, Jason, as just go click on who can help me be a destination for my data. To your point, get the data out of the building.
Yep.
Or if you want something that's a little more end-to-end concierge experience, we can definitely accommodate that as well. I would net it out to say, Jason, there's no excuse not to be following best practices.
Yeah, and so maybe our first best practice to get folks into 2022 is the idea of add more cloud to your data protection strategy. And in fact, to our producer, Mark out of Georgia, if you would take us to slide 2 on that, you see that we've been tracking the adoption of cloud-based data protection over the last couple of years. And you can, let's see, we are right at the end of 2021. So right now, statistically, about 34% of organizations are not yet using cloud, 66% are. And as we get close to that new year, we're going to flip that over. It's a little blurry, but basically on the bottom of there, as Dave mentioned, there is a promotion. If you already use Veeam, then if you go to my.veeam.com, you're going to find a banner that looks almost identical to this one where you can click, and one of the, what'd you say, 27,000 VCSPs will provide you a terabyte of free cloud storage. So you can actually just start to literally just use what you already got and just start sending it to a cloud. And I think the thing I love about this is it's not just about, sending it to a hyperscale bucket that you have to manage. It comes with all that expertise that we've spent so much time talking about already. Now, second best, so the first best practice we would tell you is add more cloud to your backup. Actually, before we get into the next one, do we have a map ready yet? I'm on one screen today, so I can't tell if we're ready for that yet. So it looks like the four of us that are on might be the only four that have actually chimed in on the chat so far. We got to update that. So, Dave, you're back in Colorado,
Yep.
as opposed to Florida. I'm in the great state of Texas. Our producer is in Georgia. Social media is out of Bucharest. But yeah, pile on. Tell us where you're from. And then also, what production clouds are you running? Because we're going to be covering that in just a minute. Dave, one of the other things I'm really keen on is why BAS when you can DRAS. Let's talk about DRAS for a second. Why is that so interesting to so many people as we get into 2022?
Yeah, I'm going to give a go at it, and then I want to toss it over to you because you're kind of Mr. DRAS. And, I think people focus on backup first because that's what they know the most, and that's where they experience a lot of pain, as we've seen from a lot of the survey work we've done. So it tends to be first and foremost in your mind. However, from a real criticality business survivability perspective, that's where disaster recovery as a service or any kind of proper DR planning and orchestration comes into play. What's your take on that?
So I love the fact that for most organizations, BAS is that first foray, right? So just get your data out of the building. And we see that, by 2023, 4 out of 5 organizations are going to be using cloud-based data protection as part of their backup. And then 1 out of 5 will realize, hey, maybe I'm late and I should do something about that. So that's backup. But the problem with if you just stop at backup as a service is if anything goes bad, you still got to suck that data back down from the cloud. I would rather just power the darn thing up. Right. So if we go to the next slide, you can see a similar adoption trend around DRAS. And I think there's 2 things about DRAS that really excite me, Dave. One is it actually makes disaster recovery so much more viable for a larger percentage of organizations, right? Back when you and I were analysts, really only large enterprises aspired to BCDR. But now, if you didn't have to have a secondary site, because the cloud is great for that, right? And you didn't have to maintain BCDR experts on staff, and those come with a DRAS provider, right? If now that you have a secondary site you don't have to care for and you don't have to pay for those DRAS experts except when you need them, all of a sudden now BCDR becomes viable for a much larger percentage of organizations. And you see that in where is the growth. On the bottom of that slide, we see organizations using self-managed dual data centers going back and forth. The top, that's where all the growth is. That's where folks are using BCDR and punchline, they're all doing it with DRAS. And I think that's really exciting for modernization. If you haven't started looking at that yet, that's our second recommendation for getting ready for 2022.
Yeah, and I want to do like a exclamation point, if you will, on 2 of the things that you mentioned there. I like the notion of why restore data essentially when you could resume, right? Instead of pull the data back and have to wait for that and have to go over certain networking kind of hurdles to achieve that, and of course egress fees potentially. Why not just resume, meaning fail over to the cloud, run in there, even if it's in a slightly performance degraded state, you are back up and operational sooner rather than later, and then you can vMotion at your heart's will when the time is appropriate. But the other thing I think is really important here as well is, the idea of this is challenging, I need help. Well, that's what we hear so much, and that's exactly where DR as a service comes into play, right? If many of us are challenged by best practices, then essentially import that skill. Let people help you through that challenge.
Totally agree with that. In my mind, the biggest challenge is not every backup admin's career evolution is going to take them into BCD or competency. There's a couple different competencies that come out of that. One is the business acumen of understanding that which processes are most important to the business, tying that back to a business impact analysis, a risk mitigation analysis, et cetera. And then the second is, for most of us that grew up as backup admins, we can make copies of stuff. But powering up a VM that went down in Dallas and now it's waking up in a secondary data center in Colorado or in a cloud to be named, that is not easy. And so having that expertise coming from that DRaaS provider, I think, is super, super important.
Well, Jason, we did get a comment from Aaron on Facebook. Could you repeat the link for that free 1 terabyte for existing customers?
Absolutely. So if you have an existing product with Veeam, when you go to my.veeam.com, that's where you can go and get your license keys reissued and those kinds of things. You will see a banner that goes right across the top of that page if you own any VBR at all, and that's where you can go and get that link for a VCSP. I actually just tried that link, 2 weeks ago, because I realized I had not updated to 11A yet. And so I went and downloaded the bits for 11A, and I saw that banner. I was like, we need to talk about that one more time before the year's out. So I actually signed up using a generic account of mine, and am kicking the tires with another VCSP even as we speak.
Nice.
So, all right. So that's, for most organizations, that's your first step, right? Get your data out of the building. And then from there, then the next thing, Dave, that you and I have watched a lot is, what does multi and hybrid cloud production look like? And so many organizations are embracing that. One of the things that I've seen a lot of on my side of the aisle, feel free to pile on, is a lot of times they're standing up those production resources first, and then once they got it all worked out, then they're going to go back and retrofit backup. That puts them in kind of a dangerous spot, doesn't it?
Yeah, and the idea of retrofit anything always scares me, because that's how sort of the proverbial can gets kicked down the road. Like, we'll get to that later, and unfortunately, later doesn't usually materialize, or at least fully materialize. That's the same reason why I think we keep seeing year after year people have frustrations with their backup practice. It's not that they didn't modernize anything, it's that they didn't do everything that they thought they would or had hoped to. So it's sort of an underlying persistent issue. And the same is true here. It's like, we're going to go make a few changes on the production side, and we hope that we're going to make corresponding changes on the backup side. And it's almost like this divergence that just continues and continues. Yep. It's off by a few degrees, but year after year after year after year, you've got this gap.
That's a great way to describe that. And you were product management for several years when you were first getting started in dev, right? And so I guess we could make the same case for, I'll add the documentation for the code later. Or you know what, I'll add the security pieces afterwards. I'll lock it down later. Let's just get it running for now. Does that, either of those sound familiar to you?
Yeah, it does. If it compiles, ship it, and we'll clean it later. I mean, that's like a maintenance programmer's nightmare right there.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. We talk about phases of modernization. Dave, a couple weeks ago, you and I had done a special LinkedIn live stream looking at data sprawl, how M&A affects things along the way. And we kind of broke down 3 phases of what modern data protection ought to look like. And in the earlier LinkedIn, we went straight to phase 2. It's like standardization becomes important, geo becomes important, evolve beyond backup becomes important. But we got 9 weeks left in the year. I would tell the folks at home, make sure everything is protected somehow, right? For all those hosted workloads, all those new platforms, Office 365, just protect everything somehow now, and then in January, maybe we can get some extra budget and do it a little bit smarter. What are your thoughts on these 3 phases, and where do you see the need for triage?
Yeah, I like this phased approach because, in a perfect world, you would not have resource constraints, meaning it wouldn't be a budget or people or time or what have you kind of an issue. But the reality is such that just chunk this down. And to your point, if I paraphrase it slightly, you can't always do everything, but you can do something. And so your goal should be make improvements where you can, and then iterate whenever possible so that you're not feeding to this divergent situation. So, this phase 1 of just cover the core products, core platforms, which are expanding. And it is an expansion, Jason. I don't think a lot of things are completely going away. We're kind of in a hybrid and multi situation. So we're dipping our toes in both ends of this. It becomes more important than ever to make sure that we're covering the new workloads and then set about standardization and that phase 2 and then aspirationally getting to phase 3 as well.
Totally buy in on that. Let's talk about some of the more modern workloads that I think a lot of folks are struggling with. And you almost just want to kind of slice off the left third of that screen and talk about hosted new workloads in Office 365. That's certainly where we're seeing a lot of the major growth right now. Let's go to what I think is probably one of the most interesting ones, which is cloud-based hosted databases. If we go to our next slide, we actually did ask this question earlier. On the left, you see whether or not people are running databases in Amazon. On the right, you see folks that are running databases in Azure. And I think it's interesting. The math is just about even. Certainly, roughly about half of organizations are still running databases, let's call it old school, Dave. We're talking about it as, they're running databases within VMs, the way that they typically would. And then about a third of organizations are using either Amazon RDS and the various databases underneath that, or obviously, if you're Microsoft, it's probably Azure SQL, and that bears true in the data. That's a big part of this. I know we want to get to the map. Let's just step to the what all we see on protecting production clouds to finish this punchline, and then I'd love to hear where people are coming from. So there's a slide on production clouds. One of the things, Dave, that we just got done announcing is Azure SQL support. We enhanced support for Azure RDS. There's a lot of stuff around production clouds that are on here. Anything else that you want to point to?
Yeah, I just love the continued maturation. We're revving each of those cloud products, meaning AWS, Azure, and GCP very quickly. And when we rev them, because they're about 75% common code, the version 2 of Google looks a lot more like, a version 3 product. And same with Azure, that version 3 product looks a lot further advanced than AWS v3 did. So not only, to your point, are we horizontally expanding out the workloads, but additional key management systems, key vault systems, ways to ensure proper data lifecycle management and to lower costs of storage. And then I think that one of the keys there is over on the right-hand side, that one platform, Jason. I think that's really very neat too.
Totally keen on that. No matter where you put your data, we got protection for that. Speaking of which, let's talk about where people are from.
Yeah, let's check out the map. Always awesome when we see a big country like Canada or Brazil come in. I know I've got to pause here, so Jason, you can make a comment about Brazil and food.
They just have better food than most of the other countries on this map. They just do. They know how to do meat, and their wine is legit. So yes, I'm a big fan of LATAM, although it'd be just as nice to see our Argentinian friends pile in afterwards. Speaking of good wine, always nice to see France in the house.
Yep, we've got France, Romania, Thailand has just come in as well, I'm being told, so that's awesome. And
Nice.
We've got Massachusetts in the United States. It's a little hard to see because it's a slightly smaller state, but awesome. There we go. There's a good blow up of that. Thank you for that. Keep questions and or where you're tuning in from coming.
Okay, so we've covered databases. We've covered. Let's go back and double click on some of those other production workloads that come in the cloud, though. Looking at production clouds, because you unpacked quite a bit right before the map happens. Because for a lot of organizations, I think there's a mid step between databases and just get your data out of the building, and that is just traditional IaaS, right? So I want the agility of virtual machines. But do I really want to keep maintaining hypervisors and farms of hypervisors? You know who else is really good at maintaining farms of hypervisors? Amazon, Microsoft Azure, GCP, right? So, but what we often see is kind of like security and documentation. They think, oh, I'll just start backing up later. That's not true. Let's go back to that slide and unpack some of the things that are there, because we start protecting. Talk about standardization. So that's the area where we've been protecting before. How do we make that more real and more scalable for folks?
Yeah, well, part of that I think is the maturation and hardening of the services on the platform. And that's where workload expansion, additional storage, low cost archiving, and automation associated with that come into play. As well as, so you cannot have a conversation in 2021 without security, whether that's roles-based access, various key management systems. And Jason, I've never claimed that to be a key management expert, but I've certainly, for like 30 plus years, been the victim of key management requests. And what I've learned is everybody wants key management their way. And so what that really means is it's important to integrate with the native tool set. If I made one last comment, what does standardization mean? It means intellectually, logically having a common approach, but natively exploiting, respecting, and getting the most out of the platform where that workload resides.
Totally down for that. In fact, one of the things I think is so interesting about how we've developed this platform is the idea that we have built this for the native administrators per workload, right? So if the only thing you did was Azure hosting, right? That's your day job of 45 hours per week you're doing Azure hosting, then the native backup for Microsoft Azure actually would work from Veeam, would work as of day one. Our V1 product is built for you. Once we start having that standardization conversation, now we can actually manage the protection of Azure and AWS and Google from that core flagship Veeam backup and replication product along the way. So that's really exciting. As we continue to evolve the Veeam backup for pick your favorite cloud products, we've added all the databases there. But there is one of probably the poster child workload in the cloud that we haven't talked about yet. And that is, well, depending on which day of the week it is, Office 365 or Microsoft 365. I know there's some rebranding going on, and I do not claim to be a 365 licensing expert. But let's unpack the 365 scenarios. And to start off with, I thought it was really interesting, Dave. This comes out of our data protection trends data. Asking organizations, are you backing up? And we see there's a massive decline in those organizations that are recognizing just using the recycle bin on the left. And thankfully, we see a massive incline in the number of organizations that are using that. Dave, I think that's, again, part of that same maturation journey is they're realizing the recycle bin is not good enough. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it really is, and besides being the poster child for probably all things SaaS, O365 and 365 data is so critical to back up, not only because it's important, but it's probably arguably the only SaaS app where you can actually do something if you have a copy of that data. I mean, you've got Exchange or Outlook, you've got SharePoint, you've got OneDrive, et cetera, Teams for that matter. So it's something that we rely on, but it's also something that you can actually use as a company, IT, or even individual users themselves. I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that, hey, we have real mission critical data here and we've got a ways to consume this. Unlike, other SaaS platforms, it's nice to have a copy of that data, but you still need to get access to the application, which you don't have.
Yep. And in fact, in one of our other studies, the Cloud Protection Trends report that we published in August, if we go to our next slide, we actually asked both Office 365 SaaS administrators and backup administrators, why do you back up Office 365 data? And I got to tell you, Dave, I was impressed. I think the SaaS admins got it right. In fact, even perhaps more notably than I would have thought. I would have thought the backup admins would have said, no, you still got to back it up. And the SaaS admins would have said, nah, we're good. It's natively durable, right? The SaaS admins get it, which I was surprised and impressed by.
Yeah, 100% agree. And the thing I like from probably both camps, but a little bit more on the SaaS side is look at the number of different things that got votes. So, I always like to look at cause of outages or reasons why you want to protect. It's multitude of things here. It's accidents happen. It's cyber. It's, we've got regulations or whatever the case may be. I like the one towards the bottom there, centralized or simplified restore capabilities. This really proves that there's a lot of things that can threaten even software as a service. There's a lot of reasons why your business is going to want to remain viable. And with that, I'm told we're getting a map update. Always awesome. Let's go check that out. So we got, we mentioned Brazil. We've got in Europe, Italy, Slovakia, the United Kingdom. I think we also have Israel in the Middle East, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there's a little bitty tiny little green dot right on the bottom of that screen. Yep.
There we go. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you for that. And
So, Dave, I know we're running up on time, but I guess one more thing I'd point out on the Office 365 side of things is I think there's a lot of confusion, not just on the recycle bin, right? So that's built in, everybody gets that. It's a matter of configuration. Then you eventually realize all those reasons why. You still got to back it up. There is sometimes confusion around, well, the premium SKUs of 365, they do parts of that too, right? But that doesn't supplant backup. Let's bring up our last slide for today. Talking about still how M365 still does need backup along the way. We're getting ready for Microsoft Ignite. I'm going to be doing some breakout sessions in that later, I think this week. Gosh, it's already here. And we looked at upgrading from the base mode of Office 365, adding to those premium E3 and E5 SKUs, and still where backup complements the native freeze tools. It's not about just DLP. It's not about legal hold. You still need backup. And so maybe for our last user to lose it, let's kind of wrap up the fact that what do we want people to know with user to lose it? One, go try a cloud provider, right? Two, check out those databases, make sure they're getting protected. And then three, go kick the tires on 365. Go check out all those cloud-hosted workloads and make sure they are protected as you're deploying them into production. And it's never too early to start that. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
So what's next on the plate? I'm looking at the clock. It's almost big hands almost on the 6th. Dave, what's up next for us?
Yeah, this Friday, our colleagues Melissa Palmer and Kirsten Stoner are going to be hosting a session called Achieve 321 Protection Your Way, meaning there's a lot of ways to achieve the 321 rule, but how you can do that and the multitude of ways that Veeam can help you do that, they're going to unpack. So check out the Friday Tech Bites 321 Your Way. We won't have a show 1 week from today, November 8th, because that is actually Veeam's 15th birthday, and our CEO has mandated that Veeam employees globally take the day off. So we will not be on next Monday. However, 1 week from that, meaning November 15th, we will have part 2 of our use it or lose it discussion that Jason and I will unpack. Until then, thank you everyone for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream.